We all have that one song that plays in our head when we think of that character. You know the one I'm talking about. You know, that character. But what if they had their own collection of songs, like as in an album? Well, in today's video, we're creating 3 album covers for some of TV's most iconic villains. Kicking us off today is the one and only Homelander from The Boys. Now, Homelander is all about stars and stripes, so for our background, I'll drop in this paper texture, and on top of that, I'll draw in the red and white stripes from his cape. Aside from his meme ability, the man's a total narcissistic psychopath, so of course, we have to reflect his lust for blood on our cover. And I'll do that by making the red part of the design blood splatter that's dripping down onto a stage. We can't be making an album cover for Homelander without the man himself, so I think it would be cool to draw him in a minimalistic way, sort of like the same vibes as the American Idiot album. I do want to use a reference so I can capture his most important features. We'll start with the shape of his body. Paint in his leather gloves, add in his belt and shoulder pads, as well as that red seam on his chest. Then we'll draw in his legs, boots, and of course, his flowing cape. We'll pick a peach color for his skin tone and give him a little neck shadow just to separate it from his head. And we can't forget that iconic platinum blonde hair. While we are going for that minimalistic look, I still want to add some shading so it looks a little less flat. I also want some softer shadows in all of the darker areas of his body. I think we can add some harsher highlights on his edges and paint in some softer highlights as well. To finish him off, let's give him his glowy laser eyes of doom. Alright, looking good, John. Now that the bulk of our soup is finished, I also want to add a shadow right under him so it looks like he's actually on the stage and not just floating. Although he technically could be floating. We can also duplicate his whole body, turn it to a solid dark red, and put it right behind him to create a really cool shadow that helps separate him from the background. Next, I grabbed this image of a crowd, and so what we can do here is mask away the people and give them a solid color. We don't want them to stand out too much. This is all about Homelander, of course. And a heads up, off camera, I committed to the full cartoony style, so you'll notice I scrapped the soft highlights and deepened all of the colors. So, finally for the title of the album. I think it's fitting that we go with the same spray painted style from the Boys logo and call this one
Stronger, Smarter, Better.
To make it stand out, the font came with some cool spray paint drips, so I can throw in a couple of those here. And I also want to fill in some of those stencil gaps. Oh, and you better believe that each one of these albums today is getting a parental advisory logo stamped right on it. After some grunge texture and fixing his laser eyes, I honestly don't think it's too far of a stretch that someone at Vought would try to release something like this to pump up Homelander's popularity, only to have him take his revenge because of how brutal this makes him look. Next up in the ring is another hot-headed narcissist that somehow got himself a redemption arc. It's Negan from The Walking Dead. 50% of the coolness of Negan's character comes from his leather jacket and baseball bat Lucille. The other half is pure charisma.
Easy peasy lemon squeezy.
So what if we sort of deconstructed Negan instead of just showing him? First things first, I want this whole scene to look like it's on a makeshift photo shoot set inside the sanctuary. I'll drop in a chair here, also similar to the one in Negan's office. We can use this nifty little tool called the perspective warp to get a better angle. Then let's lay down the floor using a concrete texture and make sure it matches up with the perspective of the chair. For the wall, I'll be using this crusty bluish texture, and we can stitch those together to make 2 walls. Now it's time for the moment you've all been waiting for. Let's grab this 3D model of a baseball bat that conveniently has barbed wire attached to it. Shout out to Envato Elements here for being the absolute best. And it looks like this model was actually a keychain, so that's no problem. We can fix that by slicing off this end of the bat and swapping it out with a brand new butt end of another bat. Let's also throw in his boots under the chair. Now it's a leather jacket time. Most of the show, Negan is wearing it zipped up, which doesn't really help here because I want to drape the jacket on the back of the chair. I did, however, find this leather jacket online that looks like an exact replica. Let's cut it off this guy by just erasing the background and his head and undershirt, and by separating them into 2 pieces, I can manually warp and adjust to make it look like he's hanging off the chair. For the inner part that's missing, I can just draw in a solid black shape and mask in a black leather texture just barely peeking through. As always, the general composition of the scene looks pretty questionable at first because there's no lighting yet. So what if we add in some big industrial windows as a main source of light? First we have to add in the glass and get the perspective just right. This is a tough process, but if we also draw in some frames and throw on the same wall texture and add shadows and highlights, we're starting to see the windows take shape. Most of the room will be dark and moody, so let's turn down those lights. Since the light is shining directly through the window, we'll also have to add the appropriate light and dark parts on the ground. We'll give the lighting on the ground some feathers so it's not as harsh. Now we have to do the same for the bat, chair, boots, and this radiator I added in. I think I'm going to skirt realism here and make these shadows a bit more stylized and less realistic so we don't overcrowd the composition with shadows. Now let's add the lighting coming from the windows onto each item. I think the leather jacket really pops now that we have that backlighting. You know, while we're at it, let's throw in a bottle on the window here to make this ledge really feel like a ledge. Negan also has a few bottles stacked up there in the show. Hang on guys, it's me from the future. At the end of making this, I realized that I totally forgot his iconic red scarf, so let's just stick it in his pocket. Okay, now back to past me. To turn up the moodiness, we can add air particles, and using a smoke brush, we can thicken up the atmosphere. I think we can also add a touch of spotlight overlays, beaming in this majestic light from the windows. Now, what to call this thing? I think if we asked the man himself, it would be a little too R-rated for this channel. So I was thinking we call this one I Am Negan, a throwback to the Savior's cult-like motto. The empty chair with the iconic accessories really invites the listener to take up the Negan identity. To finish it off, let's connect these drop shadows to give it that 3D look, and add in a slight trail so that the text stands out a bit better from the background. I honestly wouldn't be surprised if at least 1 or 2 songs on this album was a diss track against Rick Grimes. Last but not least, we have everyone's favorite chicken man and ruthless kingpin, Gus Fring from Breaking Bad. Many iconic scenes in the show take place in the desert, so of course we have to have a lot of sand and mesas in our scene. I really like this photo of the sand and the clouds, but I also want to blend in these mesas and hills. I can blur the hills that are really far away to give the whole thing a lot more depth. Okay, I want this last cover to be a little weird, and I've got a weird idea here, so stick with me. How about we drag in this giant skull right smack in the middle here? We've already done a minimalistic album cover, a semi-realistic photo shoot cover, and now I think it would be fun to do a take on surrealism. So let's make this skull belong to Gus himself and throw on his gold glasses. We can remove the lenses for now to make it look like the glasses are actually on the skull, and we'll add in some shadows coming from the glasses along the eyes. And I think adding some cracks to the lenses would really add to the grittiness of it all. Well, here's another crazy idea. How about we make the entire environment represent Gus's wardrobe? Now, Gus is the king of style. He wears the coolest suits. But I'm thinking we go with his yellow collared shirt. You know, the one that he wears at Los Pollos Hermanos. Luckily, we're not going for total realism here, so the shadow that's being cast from the skull onto the sand can be his tie. And wouldn't you know it, the sand is already his shirt color. I'll also recolor the sky to a brownish maroon that overall just brings a dark, gloomy mood to the cover. I feel like the skull can be separated from the background a bit better, so a layer of dust cloud should do the trick. And since our main source of light is coming from behind, let's add some more shading to the top as well as the darker parts of the skull and also the glasses. I feel like we can't miss the chance to make a Los Pollos Hermanos reference here, so I found this picture of the sign from the parking lot. Let's place it back here and adjust some of the lighting. It's also a bit too saturated right now, so we can bring that down. And this tree brush will help us blend it into the bush back there, so it's not just floating. I still feel like the environment still isn't as atmospheric as I'd like, so let's drop in some of these particles and more dust clouds in the foreground. This thing needs a name now, so how about we go with Gus's famous last words? No, not that. Last chance to look at me fits the mood of this one just right. We need to kick up the funkiness of this text, so some noise, The zigzag filter and some blur set to the color dodge blend mode will help us make this a bit trippier. The last thing we'll do is make the cover a bit more stylized. My secret recipe is applying some of the cool filter gallery effects and then layering them with different blend modes. This is looking good, but here's my final trick. I want to make the left side of the skull stand out from the rest of the cover. Breaking Bad fans, you know what's coming next. For those who may not be familiar with the show, Gus gets his face blown half off. It's very graphic and I can't show it here, but imagine a lot of bones and flesh. What I'll do is just use a separate artistic filter and use a curves adjustment layer with this super wacky looking graph. Whoa, I know this looks absolutely terrifying on full blast, but if we just paint in a little bit back onto the skull, we get this cool scorched effect. So instead of competing with Walter for the Empire business, maybe in another universe, Gus left it all behind to break into the music business. After you let me know which one of these albums you would listen to on repeat, don't forget to subscribe for more videos like this. Thanks everyone, take care.